Hi, and welcome back to 20th Century Stories. I am your host, Alex, and today we have a very interesting topic: life and music in the 90s. Yet again, we are joined by a real life witness, Sarah. As always, of course, I will be offering a short introduction into this topic, however, I'm sure everyone listening will already know something about the 90s, especially the music, with things like Britpop. The 1990s were a decade of change and energy. Life was shifting fast. Grunge and hip hop were shaping youth culture. Britpop was filling stadiums, and MTV was the soundtrack of everyday life. Technology was creeping into homes with the rise of the internet, while CDs and cassette tapes carried the music that defined a generation. From Nirvana and Tupac to Oasis and the Spice Girls, the 90s gave us voices that still echo today. Let's step back into that world, hearing from someone who lived it firsthand.
The automatic things you think of, most people would be Britpop, the Spice Girls. That's probably what people associate with the 90s. For me personally, I think of dance music, of clubbing, of that experience of going out and having a huge night out of dancing and some of the amazing music that was coming out that had started in the late 80s, but we were still loving that in the 90s. Because I was that little bit younger, it probably started for me on TV, ironically. So I think people maybe 5 years older than me who were part of that generation that went out clubbing and to raves in like 87. I was too young. So for me it was the early 90s. There was a TV show randomly called The Chart Show, and they had a dance chart, and that was probably the first place I ever heard that kind of music, which is kind of a strange way to do it, but it was such a good show. So I think it started there, and then there wasn't a lot of it on the radio. There was some pirate stuff maybe, but it was probably buying stuff with my pocket money and friends recording stuff for me. And then as we got a bit older and we were able to go to venues that were playing it. So I suppose in some respects it was a lot more about not listening to it at home, but finding places to go for these big parties. And obviously living in Southampton, there were some limitations in terms of what you could do, because there wasn't necessarily a lot going on here. So, and again, I suppose I'm talking about Southampton, but yeah, absolutely, it would be about buying physical music, because there was stuff on the radio, but there was probably a bit of a limitation on the kinds of stuff that got played on the radio. I think at that point there was still a lot of older people on the radio controlling the music that got played. So it was very much more about buying it, but also a lot of it was about recording each other's stuff. So there were a lot of tapes being exchanged, definitely. It was probably house parties and people playing stuff I was just blown away by. But a lot of it was going to events, going to clubs, finding stuff. And it would tend to be, rather than maybe a regular thing, it would be one of us finding out that a certain person was playing down in Bournemouth and we would go down. Um, so it was about, yeah, it was about discovering stuff. And sometimes that would be on local radio, often pirate stuff. Often it would be through friends and figuring out a way to get ourselves down there. That was how it probably really started. And in terms of genres, I mean, there was obviously house, but I think it was probably there was a lot more techno around. So a lot of kind of techno nights. Um, there was a place in the forest called the Manor, which I think is now a wedding venue. And there was a place in Bournemouth called Madison's, which I think was above a shop. There wasn't a lot going on in Southampton. And then as soon as we were old enough, it was about getting ourselves to London, because in London you had so many options, so many choices of places to go. So it started with techno. Then a lot of us started getting into maybe drum and bass as well when that started to emerge. And when I went to uni in Bristol, that was a big drum and bass town as well. So yeah, obviously there was pop. We mentioned the Spice Girls, but in the early 90s, you know, with the emergence of grunge, that felt like a 90s type of music, and that was something that was emerging as I was in my early teens. So yeah, so that was huge. All of that kind of West Coast grunge was massive. Everybody was in a band. And then I think probably we started getting into more electronic music a little bit after that. The Britpop's interesting because I think there were definitely bands within that that were great and are still going. But it was a funny one because there was a lot of music that wasn't very good, but it was kind of almost riding the coattails of Britpop. Um, but there were just a lot of bands and it was affordable. That was the other thing. You know, you could go to quite cheap gigs in Southampton down the pub and see a really well known band. So they were all there together, all mixed up together, I think. It didn't feel like they were competing, you know, that it wasn't as if the bands who were part of the Britpop scene were not into electronic music. Of course they were. So it was all, you know, as I say, all part of one big 90s optimistic, just producing lots of music kind of scene. Yeah.
Okay.
There was something about everything that was happening that felt really inclusive. So, for example, going to a warehouse party, nobody cares what you're wearing. It was later that people started to be saying, oh, you can't wear trainers, you can't wear this, you can't wear that. But also in terms of, you know, what you were wearing if you were into grunge and what you were wearing if you went out for a big, you know, techno night, they didn't differ massively. You were just probably wearing fewer clothes because it was boiling. I think when we would go out clubbing, it was very much driven by what is comfortable and is going to enable me to just dance all night. Yeah. I mean, obviously, there were people who were into other genres who maybe looked quite distinctive, but I don't remember it being particularly kind of tribal, you know? It was later that perhaps you started seeing a lot more people who were going clubbing wearing like particular colors, particular outfits, and being a bit more distinctive. Yeah. So there weren't. So I suppose because of my age, I'm thinking maybe about the early 90s, and I feel like there was a difference between the early and later 90s, that it became much more commercialized towards the later 90s. It was very kind of homemade at the beginning. And possibly that's because a big law change came in 94, the Police and Criminal Justice Act, which really cracked down on big gatherings of music. Um, Glastonbury was big. Glastonbury and Reading were big. Um, Glastonbury was possibly bigger than it is now because so many people just snuck in for free. It was much more, they didn't have the security or anything. Reading was very much about rock, but did have a little tiny bit of dance. But most festivals were really slow to start including any kind of dance music. I think Glastonbury had Orbital in about 94, 95, but that was the first kind of tiny little bit of anything. So those were really good festivals, particularly for us because we're in the south. But there wasn't a lot. There really wasn't a lot in terms of festivals. Buy your ticket. So in terms of building friendships around music, I think that I was thinking about this recently because I went to a festival, how important it was, I think, for my generation to feel completely free in that moment. There was something about that experience of being together, which I think people still experience now. Of course they do. You know, of going to a gig or going to a big event and just letting go and just having that amazing moment of kind of sharing in that amazing music. I think the challenge now is it's so expensive. Whereas I say, for us, it was affordable. We could manage it. We could do it. So we could probably do it a lot more than perhaps is possible now. But yeah, it was absolutely central in terms of friendships, definitely. What changed? I think what I mentioned about this new law actually really changed things. So you went from a situation where people were in love with the music and this shared experience, particularly with dance music. And they were all, I guess what I'm talking about when I talk about events is people were organizing their own events because there wasn't anything. So they would just find a way to do it. So it could be they're hiring a field, a farmer's field. It could be they're hiring an empty space and they're doing it themselves. And then it starts to get, I suppose, more commercialized because obviously there's a lot of money in it. It starts to get more professionalized as well because there was certainly a time where it was very basic and probably too basic. And, you know, things like they'd recognize that people weren't going to spend a lot of money in the bar of the place, so they'd turn off all the water taps in the bathrooms, like basic stuff like that. It went through some weird phases of feeling very kind of our thing and people not getting dressed up, just it's all about the music, to something that started. A lot of those experiences became much more mainstream and became something that people were maybe doing for a different reason. So things like going to Ibiza became enormously expensive because everybody suddenly wanted to do it. And there was a feeling of, well, actually, are you here for the music? Which I probably still have now, actually. If I go to something, I'm like, are you here for the music? Because it was so important to me to have that shared experience. But yeah, I mean, genre-wise, I think going into the noughties, you start to see a switch back a little bit, maybe to a lot more stuff coming out of the States. There's definitely a different kind of rock coming out of the States in the noughties. There's definitely something about it not feeling quite so equal, not feeling quite so safe in clubs, perhaps, it not feeling quite so much of a shared experience. It's starting to feel a bit more, as I say, cynical, but also just a different experience for women as well. And obviously, a lot of the DJs became extraordinarily rich. So that again changes it. It just changes the whole makeup of what you're doing. But this.
So yeah, for my final question,
Mm-hmm.
if you were to sum up the 90s
Mm-hmm.
in one word or phrase
Mm-hmm.
based on your kind of experiences,
Mm.
what word kind of would you give it?
In terms of my experience specific to like clubbing and that genre of
Yeah.
music, I would say freedom. There's a freedom to it that I hadn't felt before. So for me personally, it was something I hadn't experienced before, and I probably haven't experienced again in terms of just the like letting go. That's what I mean by freedom, you know? There's almost like almost, it sounds a bit weird. There's almost like a religious experience to it of that shared feeling of all of you doing this together and this amazing music is just a gorgeous thing. So yeah, so probably that freedom. Because remember, I'd been to convent school and grown up in a super Catholic house. So it was letting go, definitely. Freedom.
Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you. Yeah.
no worries.
So, as we've heard, back in the 90s, house and dance music pulsed through hidden raves and secret get togethers. It was raw, underground, rebellious, maybe. Beats echoing in warehouses, fields, and basements where communities came alive in the shadows. Today, those sounds have been broken into the mainstream, filling festivals and charts worldwide. But the spirit of those clandestine nights still lingers, reminding us where the movement began. Thank you once again to all you listeners who've made it this far in the episode, right to the very end. If you enjoyed this video, like always, make sure to check in a few weeks' time where I will be releasing a very emotional and impactful story, hearing from a witness who survived the Blitz and more during World War II. Thank you.